I was taking shelter in the little hotel, the Upland Goose, just a few yards behind this point here, and I realized that they were advancing up the road, and I thought it worth popping out and trying to get a few snaps. And
you were obviously very close.
Yes, I was, and it was a wide-angle lens as well, so I was actually very close. Some of the troops were suspicious, and some of them were reasonably optimistic and gung-ho. So I wasn't quite sure what to make of it, but I thought it was worth it.
You took a risk though, because you just never know. Young conscripts, armed, moving into the town, you never know how they're going to react.
Well, it's true, but I had a very strong sense that we were seeing history unfold, and it's not very often that you get a chance to do anything to record that. So I was very young, I was only 24, and I just saw it as an opportunity, so I really wanted to go for it, and that was the beginning of recording something that went on for 10 weeks or so.
Clearly, after the soldiers on foot, the heavy armour.
This was the kind of kit that really alarmed us, because it was very heavy armour, and you can see that there's a turret there with at least a 0.5-inch machine gun, if not a cannon. These were grinding through our streets, and I remember thinking at the time, it was a bit like the War of the Worlds, when these monstrous machines suddenly appear. And the day before that, we were used to Morris Minors and Land Rovers trundling down the road, and all of a sudden they were being ground to bits by these huge American-built amphibious personnel carriers, and they were scary.
And I suppose one thing as well that was, I'm sure, deeply alarming for residents in the Falklands is that this is clearly, heavy-duty equipment. It's going to make taking the Falklands back that much more difficult for the British?
Well, we assumed that. In actual fact, because they were amphibious and they were very, very heavy, they weren't particularly good for working outside of Stanley, or outside of the concrete streets of Stanley, so they withdrew them fairly soon afterwards, and they were not an ongoing threat, but they certainly were that day. In fact, their victory on the 2nd of April was completely down to these vehicles here, because the Governor, Rex Hunt, at the time said when he heard these were approaching, he knew that the game was up at that point, really. These were Pucará aircraft. They were designed and built in Argentina, and they were a very real concern because their ground attack capability was quite serious. You can see the drums on the wings that would have contained rockets, and they were fitted with machine guns as well. And in this occasion, that aircraft is circling low, very low over Stanley, and it went on for about half an hour because we could see there were a couple of Harriers at altitude just waiting for the chance to pounce on them. They could not compete with a Harrier, but on their own against ground troops they were very effective.
With this one, the garrison's headquarters there in Stanley as well, the Argentinian flag, I mean, that's very symbolic.
Yeah, and that struck me. I framed this out of my bedroom window, in fact, and I like the sort of domesticity. You've got the kitchen chimney there with the Argentine flag in the background, and the Argentine flag is actually flying from our Defence Force HQ mast, so there was something particularly symbolic about that. They'd taken over the Defence Force headquarters.
Graham, tell us about this shot.
Well, the Argentines were very poorly equipped with vehicles, so they took any civilian vehicle that took their fancy, and you can see that the demand far exceeded supply. I did count how many Argentines were in this short wheelbase Land Rover, but
quite a few.
Certainly wasn't designed for that. But we all lost our vehicles, including mine and my father's. They would turn up with a piece of paper and the number of your vehicle written on it and a couple of rubber stamps and said, "We're having it." And the usual story was, we're going to use it as an ambulance, but then they weren't. You'd see them the next day, full of troops.
Clearly, this one very starkly illustrates the human cost of this conflict. We know hundreds on both sides died, but he's lying right in the street of your hometown.
Yeah, there were a couple of bodies lying there, and fortunately for me, they had been covered up very roughly. But on the morning of the surrender, a friend and I decided that we would walk up towards where we knew the British lines were, And we first of all encountered these unfortunate Argentine soldiers who'd clearly been killed by artillery because the fence behind was riddled with shrapnel, and it was pretty clear that the same thing had happened to them. So at the time, I remember, actually my mind goes back to these photographs very, very often. At the time, I wasn't sure whether I should photograph it or not. And when it came to mounting this exhibition, I wasn't really sure whether I should use it or not. But you know, that is the reality.
It's war.
That's the truly horrible reality. I mean, I don't know, he was a young man and, you know, he didn't go home.
The surrender in full swing here. I mean, you can see all the detritus around the streets as well.
These Argentines are being rounded up by British troops. You can see, I think, Paras or Marines doing their best to round them up and at the same time getting these men to clear up a little bit. But the mess was unspeakable. This was one of our general stores here, which had been torched and was gone, but the smoke was still lingering. And when I look at these, I can almost still smell them. It was just a complete scene out of hell, frankly.
So you can see all the detritus just on the street there.
But this time things had unraveled completely, and there was no discipline left up until, let's say, a few hours before that. It's quite interesting because in the background is HMS Plymouth, and she was, I think, disabled with a bomb and had been hit just shortly before that. So she was the first ship of the task force into the harbour.
I guess we've got to expect, Graham, that with any military victory comes the pomp and the pageantry that we expect from the military who've secured this key objective, and that's what you're seeing alongside, of course, the human cost.
That's right. We sort of segue into colour here because very shortly after the surrender I laid my hands on some slide film. And yeah, it strikes me still that the short period of transition between total chaos and the death and destruction to everything being organised in a much more ceremonial and civilized way. It's just a different aspect to the whole story. And the graves, the coffins being prepared for burial there, that is a little bit later. That's at Blue Beach Military Cemetery. And the relatives were given the choice of having their next or their loved ones who had fallen there buried in the Falklands or taken back to the UK. And of course that's the coffin of Lieutenant Colonel H. Jones, VC. So yeah, it becomes moving in a different kind of way.
This photograph here, I suppose, shows the big political gamble that the leader of the time in the UK took in deciding to prosecute this war to restore the islands to British rule.
Absolutely. Mrs. Thatcher had to go to the Falklands. It was so important in her story and remains so. And she is still held in the greatest respect in the Falklands. She's been greeted by Rex Hunt, the governor at the time, who'd been deported by the Argentines but came back as quickly as he could. And yeah, it was, I remember being told by the army press officer, he rang me up and he said, we've got something interesting happening today. I can't tell you what it is, but get yourself to the airport by a certain time and we'll have a good story for you. And he certainly did. That was the story.
Graham, this is your local airport in Port Stanley, but clearly at the time that was a military base for the Argentinians.
It was a tiny airport and they took it over and without extending it, made it into a major air base, and they were flying large aircraft into it from Argentina as well. I used to watch 737s and Hercules flying in at night under the British radar. And of course the British tried to bomb it repeatedly, and the Pucarás were based there, these very nasty little ground attack aircraft. But in the immediate aftermath of the war, when the RAF took it over, they just cleared everything away. So all these Pucarás were dumped off the end of the runway. And you can see here Stanley Harbour itself is full of big ships. In those days, I think at one point we were the busiest harbour in the southern hemisphere, which seems hard to believe. But of course, there was a huge need to get supplies into the Falklands.
For these people, it was their home, and they were, very badly affected by what happened. Tell us about these pictures.
people's homes were destroyed. The population of Stanley went from about 1,400 people down to 500 people, and many of them thought they would be safer out on the farms. And many of them went to Goose Green, for example, or to Pebble Island. And, you know, the words frying pan and fire come to mind, you know, because if they went to Goose Green, they were there locked up and had to endure the Battle of Goose Green. And this gentleman, Griff, who is a shepherd, he was actually the farm manager on Pebble Island, had been locked up with all the other people on the farm in one house for a period of about a month, having a pretty tough time. And he's now very definitely happy to be out with his sheep again. Joe, repairing his fence, which had just been run down by a military truck. And I kind of feel that the whole Falklands War, yes, it was about the Falkland Islanders, but it became far bigger than them, so much more than about the Falkland Islanders. And it's remained that way to a great extent. And everybody at the end of it just had to pick themselves up and get on with their lives. And I look at these guys, both of whom are now gone, and I'm quite proud of them, and I think they did a really good job. I wish they weren't perhaps a little bit forgotten, and it's taken a long time for people to realize that. And when I was presenting these photographs in the Falklands, I said to the people, most of whom I knew very well, that I think after 40 years, it was about time they, without wishing to sound too sentimental, gave themselves a bit of a hug and said, yeah, we did have a tough time, didn't we?